2,711 were built during the war, hundreds of them here in the Portland area. They were 441 feet long, 56 feet wide, and carried 9,000 tons of cargo. The average length of construction was a little over 19 days and cost $2 million per ship. One was built in a record 111 hours. That's about 4.5 days. Perhaps the greatest impact domestically was the changing role of women in our society. Before America's entry into the war, the vast majority of women worked in the home. Careers outside the home were limited to mostly nursing, teaching, librarian, and secretarial. After Pearl Harbor, millions of women began entering the American workforce. One of the heroes of the home front was Rosie the Riveter, who is pictured right there, with the iconic motto, "Yes, we can." Gone forever was the notion that American women were weak, silly, dainty little creatures, capable of building or baking a cake, but incapable of building battleships, tanks, bombers, or anything else. In 1942, my Aunt Lucy volunteered to join the WWII. The United States Navy that year opened to women its ranks for the very first time in its history. She served in the Washington, D.C. area. There are somewhere in this exhibit souvenirs, photo souvenirs, which picture what nightlife was like in a major world capital during the greatest war in human history. She was proud to, the last part of her life, to have been a pioneer in the opening the door of opportunity for succeeding generations of women interested in serving their country. And she's buried at Arlington National Cemetery. 2 days after Pearl Harbor, Franklin Roosevelt addressed the nation saying in order to win the victory, there would be a job for every man, woman, and child in the nation, and that America expected every citizen to do their duty. Children conducted scrap metal drives and bought war bonds. Rationing became a way of life. "There's a war on" became the new national credo. In May of 1942, the U.S. Office of Price Administration began the rationing of tires, sugar, flour, meat, silk, shoes, nylon, coffee, cheese, canned milk, canned fish, processed foods, bicycles, and all metal. Civilian production of cars and trucks ceased immediately. The entire industrial might of the United States was focused on war production. On December 1st, 1942, gas rationing began in an effort to conserve rubber tires. All the sources for natural rubber were in the hands of the Japanese. Most of the general public were designated Class A and could receive only 3 gallons of gasoline per week with ration stamps. No stamps, no gas. Somewhere in our exhibit is a gas ration stamp book, which would have been vital. Cigarettes were not rationed, but the majority of production went to the troops. Here again in the exhibit there's the top of a cigarette carton that says, "Not for resale, for troops abroad." Everywhere across the home front were posters. A few examples of these are shown both here and in the rest of the exhibit. Civilians were urged to buy war bonds, to donate blood, to enlist in the service. And here, notice the subtle use of language. People didn't talk about joining the military. They talked about joining the service. The posters encouraged hard work in defense industries. A number of posters cautioned against idle gossip. Loose lips sink ships. On some of these posters, you'll notice a gold star. That indicated a family member from that household had died in defense of this nation. By 1945, it would have been a rare street in Portland that didn't have at least one house with a gold star in the window. Among the books my family have donated to the Historical Resource Center is The War, based on Ken Burns' documentary of the same name. I highly recommend both the book and the documentary to anyone interested in a deeper understanding of World War II. I think the most moving section is a monologue by Bill Malden, who was then a young cartoonist with the Army newspaper Stars and Stripes. He looks at the camera with a deadpan expression and says, "So, you want to know what it's like for the infantry? Go out on a cold, rainy autumn afternoon and dig a shoulder-deep hole in your backyard. Climb down into that hole. Stay in that hole as it slowly fills with rain. Do not leave that hole for any reason. That night, as arsonists set fire to your neighborhood, have a prankster set off a firecracker right next to your head every time you start to doze off to sleep. After 3 days, climb out of that hole. Fill a large suitcase with rocks, then start climbing the steepest hill you can find. Fall down every few steps. Pick yourself back up and keep walking. After a few months of this, you'll begin to understand what it's like for the infantry when times are good. No one can ever describe to you what it's like when times are bad." In 1943, my father, Francis McSherry, joined the Army. He did basic training at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. He went to North Africa in 1943 in a combat engineer unit. Here we go. This picture shows him with some buddies in front of a truck. It was the truck that he drove, and he named it after my mother. It says Dorothy across the bumper. After the war, he would jokingly comment that she never gave him any grief. He never rode her clutch, and he changed her oil every 2,000 miles. My mother was not amused by this. In late 1944, he returned to the United States for a 60-day leave before going to the South Pacific island of Saipan. There he joined another combat engineer unit charged with building airstrips for the Army Air Corps' new bomber, the B-29. These long-range bombers could reach the Japanese home islands and would take the war to the enemy, which is exactly what they did. On the night of March 9th through the morning of March 10th, Operation Meeting House burned 15 square miles of Tokyo to the ground. 334 B-29s operating at low level and using incendiary bombs created a firestorm with hurricane-force winds. It's estimated that in one night, at least 100,000 Japanese died, with another 41,000 wounded or injured, and 1 million people made homeless. Once the airstrips were completed in the spring of 1945, my father's unit began training for the upcoming invasion of Japan. The first stage would be the invasion and occupation of the island of Kyushu, codenamed Operation Olympic. It would be the greatest amphibious invasion in history, several times larger than D-Day in Normandy. George Marshall, Chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, told President Roosevelt to prepare the nation for 1 million American casualties. It was estimated that Operation Olympic alone would result in 460,000 casualties, with at least 110,000 dead. The commander of my father's unit told him that they'd be part of the second wave of the first day and to expect 80% casualties. To keep the men busy and their minds occupied, the unit folded laundry for the Navy in the afternoon. And this picture here shows them hard at it. You can tell they're enthusiastic about it. The picture shows them hard at it. My father is seated second from the right. The soldier right next to him, the one that's standing, pale, his name was Shockley, and he was from the Ozark Mountains in Missouri. He became my father's best friend. They formed a partnership. Shockley knew how to make moonshine, and my father knew how to wheel and deal all the ingredients that Shockley needed: sugar, yeast, fruit juice, in big metal pots.